Hello again, 122. In this video, we conclude the Great War and the results for Europe in the post-1918 period. In the years 1916-17 were the great slaughter, because this war devolved into the unexpected development of trench warfare on the Western Front, and it baffled military leaders who had been trained to fight wars of movement and maneuver. Periodically, the high command on either side then would order an offensive that would begin with an artillery barrage to flatten the enemy's barbed wire and leave the enemy in a state of shock. After softening up the enemy in this fashion, a mass of soldiers would climb out of their trenches with fixed bayonets and hope to work their way toward the enemy trenches across no man's land. And these attacks rarely worked, as the machine gun put hordes of men advancing unprotected, except for those rifles and bayonets, across open fields at a severe disadvantage. And in 1916 and 1917, millions of young men were sacrificed in search of the elusive breakthrough. In 10 months at Verdun in 1916, 700,000 men lost their lives over a few miles of terrain. And the Battle of the Somme in 1915 was another slaughter battle between the British, French, and the Germans. And here is an Allied trench. Those are some African troops actually fighting for the Allies. And here are some pictures of the Germans with their machine guns, and the machine guns just made those tactics obsolete. The entry of the United States was most important, because the Allied cause now was greatly aided, and it grew out of the naval conflict between Germany and Great Britain. Britain used its superior naval power to maximum effect by setting up a naval blockade of Germany. So Germany retaliated by imposing a counter blockade enforced by the use of unrestricted submarine warfare. And strong American protests over the German sinking of passenger liners, especially the British ship Lusitania on May the 7th, 1915, when more than 100 Americans lost their lives, forced the German government to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare in September 1915 with the Sussex Pledge and a couple of other agreements. But by January 1917, however, eager to break the deadlock in the war, the Germans decided on another military gamble by returning to unrestricted submarine warfare. The German naval officers convinced Emperor Wilhelm II that the use of unrestricted sub-warfare could starve the British into submission within 5 months, certainly before the Americans could act. And the return to unrestricted sub-warfare brought the United States into the war on April 6, 1917. Also the Zimmermann Note, where a German ambassador, Alfred Zimmermann, promised the Mexican government that they could get their territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back if they would join the Central Powers side. And the British intercepted that note and made it public. And although the U.S. troops did not arrive in Europe in large numbers until the following year, the entry gave the Allies a huge psychological boost. The year 1917 had not been a good year for them. Allied offenses on the Western Front were disastrously defeated. The Italian armies were smashed in October, and in November the Bolshevik Revolution, which we'll go over in a later video, led to Russia's withdrawal from the war and left Germany free to concentrate entirely now on the Western Front. The cause of the Central Powers looked favorable, although war weariness is setting in all of these countries. It's beginning to take its toll in the Allied effort also. Women in the war effort. World War I also created new roles for women. With so many men off fighting at the front, women were called on to assume jobs and responsibilities that they had not been open to them before, including jobs that had been considered beyond the capacity of women. These included such occupations as chimney sweeps, truck drivers, farm laborers, and factory workers in heavy industry. And on page 606, Naomi Logan talks about her experience in munitions work. In Germany, 38% of the workers in the Krupp's armament works in 1918 were women. But Despite this notable increase, and this is a nice poem now, War Girls, a British poem written in 1916. There's the girl that clips your ticket for the train, describing the different occupations. And the girl who speeds the lift from floor to floor. There's the girl who does a milk round in the rain. And the girl who calls for orders at your door. Strong, sensible, and fit. They're out to show their grit and tackle jobs with energy and knack. No longer caged and penned up. They're going to keep their end up till the khaki soldier boys come marching back. And that's from Scars Upon My Heart, Women's Poetry and Verse in the First World War, London Press, 1981, page 90. And the last line is the key, because at the end of the war, governments moved quickly to remove women from the jobs that had encouraged them to take earlier, and the wages who remained employed faced lower wages than men. Wartime economies did have a positive impact on the women's movement for social and political emancipation. The most obvious gain was the right to vote, granted to women in Britain in January 1918 and in Germany and Austria immediately after the war. The last year of the war, 1918, for Germany, the withdrawal of Russia in March 1918 offered renewed hope for a favorable end to the war. And the victory over Russia, signified by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, persuaded Erich von Ludendorff, who guided the the German military operations, that most German leaders, and they're going to make one final military gamble, a grand offensive in the West to break the stalemate. And the German attack was launched in March and it lasted into July. But an Allied counterattack, supported by the arrival of 140,000 fresh American troops, defeated the Germans at the Second Battle of the Marne on July 18th, and Ludendorff's gamble had failed. So, on September 29, 1918, General Ludendorff informed the German leaders that the war was lost and insisted that the government sue for peace at once. When the German officials discovered, however, that the Allies were unwilling to make peace with the autocratic imperial government, reforms were instituted to create a liberal government. Meanwhile, popular demonstrations broke out throughout Germany, and Wilhelm II capitulated to public pressure, and he abdicated his throne on November the 9th. And the socialists under Friedrich Ebert announced the establishment of a republic, the Weimar Republic. And 2 days later, on the 11th month of the 11th day of the 11th hour, the new German government agreed to an armistice, a ceasefire, and now the war was over. So how did the Germans then end up losing World War I? This was a devastating war. Between 8 and 9 million soldiers died on the battlefield, and another 22 million were wounded. And many who survived the war died later from war injuries or lived on with different forms of mutilation. And the birth rate in many countries declined noticeably as a result of the death and maiming of so many young men. World War I also created a lost generation of war veterans who had become accustomed to violence and who would later band together in support of Mussolini and Hitler in their bids for power. The peace settlement will be where Germany loses the war. In January 1919, Allied nations gathered in Paris for the settlement of the Great War. And over a period of years, the reasons for fighting World War I had been transformed from selfish national interests to idealistic principles. And no one expressed these principles better than United States President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's proposals for a truly just and lasting peace included open diplomacy instead of secret diplomacy, the reduction of national armaments to a point consistent with domestic safety, and most of all, national self-determination of people with well-defined national aspirations. They should be accorded the utmost satisfaction. As a spokesman for a new world order based on democracy and international cooperation, Wilson was enthusiastically cheered when he arrived in Europe. He's the first American president to go overseas for any extended period of time. He was gone for months. And when the peace conference held at the Palace of Versailles began, his rhetoric on self-determination inspired people in the colonial world. But he's a generation ahead of his time, ladies and gentlemen. but he's very influential in developing the anti-colonial nationalist movements in these eras. And his reception really went to Wilson's head, and that will impact him in negotiations back in the States after the treaty is formed. He found, however, more practical motives guided the other states at the conference. Those secret treaties and agreements could not be totally ignored, even if they did conflict with self-determination. National interest also complicated the deliberations of the Paris Peace Conference. David Lloyd George, who is now the Prime Minister of Britain, got elected on a platform of making the Germans pay for this dreadful war. And France's approach to peace was primarily determined by national security. Georges Clemenceau, who had led his country to, quote, victory, unquote. The French people had borne the brunt of German aggression, and they deserved revenge and security against future German aggression. And the most important decisions were made by the Big Three. And in the end, only compromise made it possible to achieve a peace settlement. And Wilson's wish, above all else, that the creation of an international peacekeeping organization be the first order of business was granted. And already on January 25, 1919, the conference adopted the principle of the League of Nations. In return, Wilson agreed to make compromises on territorial arrangements to guarantee the establishment of the League, which he believed could later rectify bad arrangements. And here is what is carved out of the old Ottoman Empire, which no longer exists. This is a French mandate, and these areas are now controlled by the British, and they're going to discover oil here, and that's going to be very huge for the West. The Treaty of Versailles was 5 separate treaties with the defeated nations, but the Treaty of Versailles with Germany, signed on June 28, 1919, was by far the most important one. The Germans considered it a harsh peace and were particularly unhappy with Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which declared that Germany and Austria were responsible for starting the war and ordered Germany to pay reparations for all the damage to which the Allied governments and their people were subjected as a result of the war. These are 2 major causes now for the Second World War. This assigned Germany, and it was, as we saw, there were many other causes of the First World War. The military and territorial provisions of the treaty also rankled the Germans. They lost their territories and colonies in the Pacific and in Africa. Their army had to be reduced. The navy was cut back. The air force was eliminated. And they also lost the Alsace and Lorraine that they had gained in 1871 in that Franco-Prussian War. And sections of Prussia were given to the new Polish state, and we'll look at that map in a moment. German land west, as far as 30 miles east of the Rhine, was established as a demilitarized zone and stripped of all armaments or fortifications to serve as a barrier to any future German military moves westward against France. This was believed secured France's national security. And outraged by the dictated peace, which blames them for causing the war, the new German government complained but accepted the treaty. And this is the Europe of 1919. All of these nations are carved out of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which goes away. Czech Republic is independent today. Slovakia is independent. Romania is still there. Hungary. Yugoslavia today is 7 countries. And this was created out of all of those different... This is the powder keg of Europe. There's Alsace and Lorraine given back to France. The Rhineland is a demilitarized zone. And Italy, Vittorio Orlando was at the conference, and he was mainly concerned with securing more territory for Italy, and he got it. And again, these were the areas carved out of the old Ottoman Empire. And that concludes the Great War.